Hey, gang. I hope you're third week into the semester. Is that true? Are we already on week three? Goodness, this is going quickly. So I appreciate your first 2 weeks of content. A lot of you really dug into the discussion. I appreciate the depth at which you're engaging each other, the depth at which you're engaging the material. Many of you have experiences in the field and personal experiences that can really deeply relate to the information that makes this class so much better. So thank you so much for all the effort you're putting in, the engagement. I had a chance to read through. I gave you all feedback on your, limitations of the ACE study. There are some definite limitations. The thing I want to talk about this week and moving forward are really the implications where we are now. ACE really became a thing in 1998 when Anda and Folletti published, their first real big significant findings. And as they've said, people question them, people question their results. It was so earth shattering that people, when you get into science, people, okay, is this replicable? Can we go in and can we repeat this? Is this actually real data? And so what has happened and over time, people have replicated and other fields and other disciplines have jumped in. And first they're medical doctors. They're not psychologists. They're not counselors. They're really coming in from a different discipline. And so you're looking at healthcare, you're looking at sociology, you're looking at social work, you're looking at education, you're looking at psychology, you're looking at counseling, you're looking at all neuropsychology, biopsychology, neuroscientists, physicians, like they started with all these people. If you ever watch Nadine Burke talk, she's a pediatrician, so it's like you have all these people that are invested and have begun and researched and done all this research into, is this a real thing? And it is a real thing. And anybody who's worked with children, with families in psychology can tell you, go all the way back to Freud. Unfortunately, we got to, with all the problems of Freud, looking back at those first few years of development being so critical, being so, if you have a fixation, and that's a Freudian psychodynamic term. If you get fixated at one of those stages, and I debate the stages too, but focusing in on those early experiences and how they shape us is so fundamental. It's so fundamental to our field. It's so fundamental, whether you're an educator, whether you're a counselor. As I was thinking today, I got to thinking a lot about my trainings in the field. So, coming out of Meadow Lake Hospital, where I didn't have training to work with kids with trauma, should have been the first thing. Should have been the first thing before I ever entered the door as a mental health worker. It should have been the first thing before I ever entered the door as a counselor. You're going to sit through 2 weeks of ACE, understanding ACEs. That wasn't there. That wasn't a thing then. As I mentioned before, the ACE study used to really just finish, like when I was first, the reason I was first experienced that study was Oklahoma got sued. Oklahoma got sued because we allowed children to die when they're in state custody. And, our system was so brutal, so punitive to kids that were in foster care. We got sued by, and justifiably so, class action suit. So it required our state to rethink and relook at what we were doing, especially particularly to kids in the child welfare system in state custody. And I remember, again, going to that first training and like just this, it's like this all makes sense now. Everything that I've experienced for the first 7 or 8 years in the field, working with children, adults, people with addictions, all made sense. All those stories that I heard, all those things that were impactful. Like, okay, yeah, it has to do with child trauma. It has to do with trauma. And to summate all of this, those traumas tend to have common impacts on the body. Now, obviously there are outliers, as I mentioned to most of you. Just because you have a high ACE score doesn't mean you have a fate. That's the authors will say that as well. Folletti and Anda are very quick to say this isn't a diagnostic tool. This isn't used to diagnose or screen or assess. That's not what it was for. It's there as an epidemiological tool. It's there to, you know, we should take a look at this as a society, because this is a big thing. And how we do that, I think the ACE questionnaire by itself is awful. It really is. It's just, who in their right mind, what client is going to come in and in the first session, like it's used now in a lot of places, just answer, have you ever been sexually abused? Has anybody ever touched you, fondled you, whatever? Those questions are worded. What client in their right mind that has any level of defensiveness is going to answer that on the first session? It's ludicrous. It really, the way it's being, it's valuable. I'm not saying it's not valuable, but the way it's being used is not the way it was intended. Those 10 questions were interspersed with 120 different questions on a questionnaire to people that were as part of their health insurance. It wasn't like this loaded thing up front. I remember going through countless assessments with people, and even before the ACE questionnaire was a thing, where have you ever been sexually abused? That was a requirement in the state screening. Yeah, somebody's just going to pop off and tell you that the first session. Sure, why not? Yeah, especially like a 14-year-old. Yeah, you just told me you're going to report that. So yeah, let me just tell you all that's happened to me. Just so ludicrous. I'm sorry, I'm getting worked up thinking about it. The way that we use it is ludicrous. And the authors, I think, would, I know they would support that statement. But it's still important work. I went to a trauma-informed training of trainers. So I'm still state certified to train people to become trauma-informed, to train systems to become trauma-informed. This manual, this was a few days to go through and think about. This person, Joseph Benamati, actually worked with the sanctuary model before he was trained in trauma-informed systems, worked with the juvenile justice system in New Jersey before he trained us. I remember that from the training. And the biggest thing I've taken away, here's my big packet from Dr. Anda. This was amazing a few years ago. This is his understanding ACEs, trying to transform communities. So this big packet of information on and he's one of the original authors. I've also heard Folletti talk a couple of different times, a couple of different occasions, had a chance to shake his hand. I've spent a lot of time in my career researching, thinking about, working with people with trauma. And the one thing that I can come up with is that, and this would come from these other trainings, we are of no use to, it's almost like a multicultural thing. We are of no use to making a difference in a trauma-informed way if we don't first recognize and deal with and contend with the trauma in ourselves. I think I've mentioned this before in another place. Those in helping professions tend to have higher ACE scores, tend to be higher up. We tend to have been through more. It was really, that was first brought out here with Joseph Benamati. That was also echoed with Dr. Anda. There's been studies that have replicated that. What I mean by that is, when people experience traumas, really tough events, really hard things in their lives, doesn't even necessarily have to be in childhood, there's a common reaction, common bodily reaction, physiological reaction that we psychologically, I'd argue, that we really struggle and at times do not have control over. That flies in the face of a lot of theories, psychological theories that say, oh, well, the client needs to take ownership of it. So I have a hard time with that, because if you have a physiological reaction, if you don't know that it's happening, how are you going to take control of it? So for instance, when we have a really traumatic event happen, we have a huge surge of adrenaline, a huge surge of adrenaline. And that quickly drops off. The adrenaline, the heartbeat starts racing, all the muscles contract, and you have this fight versus flight response. The blood flow to the brain shuts down, the blood flow to like the stomach shuts down. You think about the butterflies, things like that. it goes to your extremities, gets ready to fight, flight, or freeze, gets you ready for that. There's a secondary reaction, and this comes directly from ACE research. Not just does this adrenaline peak and then come down, so our kidneys kick on, the adrenal glands kick on, it gets us ready to battle. After that starts to subside, there's cortisol, and I know I've talked about this. Cortisol, the chemical that in the short run helps with damage control, helps with, if you have inflammation in a shoulder or a joint, they get a shot of cortisol. This cortisol in your body in the short run is anti-inflammatory, helps. But in the long run, it does a lot of damage. You can't have it a lot. It's neurally toxic. It's toxic to your body. That the inflammation process is actually made worse. And so that surges right after the adrenaline. So your body expects to have this trauma when you go through something psychologically tormenting, even if you don't have a bodily trauma, psychologically traumatic. Your body still reacts as if it's trying to heal itself. So you have all this cortisol, and this cortisol does not easily drop. It's not like the adrenaline that comes and goes quickly. If you look at the graph, there's a graph that adrenaline peaks really quickly and starts to subside, and then here's this cortisol, and it's still increasing. If you think about that, if you think about that on a physical level, you get hurt, and then the next day you're really, you need to be able to function right after the trauma. You get the endorphins and things, so you need to be able to function to survive. So it's a survival thing. But then if you don't get that ameliorated, you don't get that response where you get help, that cortisol keeps peaking, and that's what we're talking about, this toxic stress of ACEs. And people tend to live, people that have been through ACEs, people that have been through traumatic experiences, tend to recreate those things. If you look at some of the underlying, one of the major components of this theory right here used to treat PTSD and addiction is people recreate the traumas that they've experienced. People may become their own worst enemies, so to speak. Some people just kind of live in day-to-day drama, and a lot of our clients will too. And sometimes we adopt those patterns. And I won't say sometimes. If we're working in environments with other professionals, and we're already working in a system where those other professionals are more likely to have experienced traumas, that's a recipe for disasters, because we're also working with clients who have been through more traumas. So now the clients have had more traumas, and so the people helping them have had more traumas, and those systems tend to be underfunded and overstressed. You have a recipe for disaster, really. That's like a powder keg, because then you have all these conflicts. You have, really the response I want you to get from this is hypervigilance. And what hypervigilance is, it is a product of trauma. It is a product of us living through really bad things, whether it's child, it could be adverse child, it could be just as an adult, it could be a veteran going through a war, it could be somebody that's been through divorce, death of a parent. You live through these really hard times, and we develop these responses, and they're physiological. They're not all psychological, they're physiological. And so, somebody that is hypervigilant, somebody that is quick to they're out to get me. That's a very common response. And then maybe becoming aggressive with other people and misinterpreting social cues. That's a huge one in kids, huge one in people. This hypervigilance develops. I think we're there as a society. We really have a very limited understanding of our hypervigilant responses to each other, particularly on social media. But anyway, it's important to recognize these things in ourselves. The one thing that, if you want to create a trauma-informed culture, and that comes directly from that training, is to recognize and to get in control of these things, these hypervigilant responses in ourselves. Taking those timeouts to take deep breaths, taking timeouts to get that cortisol, to get that adrenaline under control, to put our normal, higher reasoning, rational thought processes back in play. Put these frontal lobes that we have, that we're gifted with, put those in play. You restore the blood flow there through the deep breathing, through the meditation, through the grounding. Get in control of that. And secondly, if you recognize it and you control it yourself, secondly, recognize that in that other person. That other person that you're having the problem with, whether it's a client, whether it's a colleague, okay, that person likely has been through trauma and they're experiencing this flood of emotion. They're experiencing all of these things. So what can I do to mitigate this? What can I do to come in and create safety? Because when you heighten these tensions, when you stress the system out, you stress the person out, you stress the person out that's coming in for help, that's when problems happen. And so to be a healthy professional, to help create a trauma-informed system, you have to first be healthy yourself. And secondly, you have to be aware of that same processes and the tendencies of others to fly into that hypervigilance. If we can do that, we should be more apt than these other systems outside that are well-funded, that get all the resources to adapt and change and do well. But that is necessary. And so as I'm talking here throughout this semester, I want you to recognize the impact of trauma in yourself. I want you to recognize the impact of trauma in your clients. I also want you to recognize the impact of trauma in those you work with, who you're around on a day-to-day basis. I also want you to recognize the impact of trauma in the system and the stressed systems that then create this toxic mix. That was Ben Amani's big critique of Oklahoma's system of child welfare when we were sued, is that you have one child welfare worker with 120 kids, and half of them are priority one. They've been through very significant problems. That's why they're taken into custody. You have several in group homes. You don't get a chance to check on them, and yet, you have a person who's been called into the field. Child welfare workers don't go in the field because they want to hate kids, hate families. That's not the reason why. I've worked with a lot of child welfare workers over the years. They get quickly burned out because they're asked to do too much with too little, with people, with the most vulnerable people in our society. Even look at your spirituality books, that take care of the orphan, the widow. In different cultures, that's the most vulnerable person. That's there because there is nobody there to take care of them. And we continually shortchange that population in particular. I would argue that people that have been through, significant mental health problems, like veterans, like police, like first responders, sexual abuse survivors, domestic abuse survivors, none of those people get the resources they need. And yet they expect us to come in with a cape and fix everything. And so you need this knowledge. You need this knowledge to be able to navigate these difficult situations, these difficult systems, and stay healthy yourself. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful. I appreciate your very deep commitment to this class. I look forward to our interactions throughout. Take care. Please reach out if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you online.